This is Donna, and we are live in Nashville at the CBA Unite Conference, and I am here with author Randy Dockens, and he has a trilogy out, The Coded Message.
Right.
And so we're going to talk a little bit about those books today. Randy, I'll let you kind of start off by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, well, I'm a scientist. I'm actually a pharmacist by training. Mm-hmm. I went to pharmacy school, practiced for a short time, and then I decided to go back to school. And so I put myself through graduate school working as a pharmacist. And so then I worked for the Food and Drug Administration for a couple years as a what they called a pharmacokinetic reviewer. Which is the sort of studying how drugs work in the body, and then switched to pharmaceutical industry. Then after a while, I had always loved studying the Bible and stuff. My father was a Sunday school teacher, and so I think that's where I got my love of the Old Testament. And so I started taking some courses, and then they asked, "Wait, do you want to take this for credit or for audit?" And I thought, well, if I'm going to do it, I might as well do it for credit. And so one thing led to another, and then I got a master's in Jewish studies, and then I got a PhD in biblical prophecy. So then I was like, well, how do I combine all this, together? And so this was my first attempt here, where that it's showing how science really points to God, rather than being divergent from Him.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, and we've had a couple books that have even helped, try to prove, God through science.
Right.
So,
Yes.
Yeah. So talking about that, so in this book, you make the claim about science and faith can go hand in hand. So did you grow up a Christian and come to faith later, or how did your interest?
Yeah. Well, I think I became a Christian before I became a scientist. I became a Christian probably around when I was like 12. So I sort of always had the Christian background, and so, but I always had a love for science and math. So that sort of led me down that road. So I never really doubted that, that God, I never doubted that science would be opposed to God. So sometimes you went through a struggles of, well, how do I make it make sense for me? Because I knew the two had to be congruent. And I think that was one of the reasons for this, especially in this second book, in FSHS, it shows like the atom on the cover. And so it's really showing like how the internal workings of an atom actually show the divinity of God and some of His characteristics. So you think, well, if an atom on the quantum level can have the characteristics of God, then it's showing that science shows sort of the fingerprint of God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was thinking too, like from your science background, even in the pharmaceutical and FDA, did that kind of help give you like stories for the book or scenes from the book, like having that experience?
Yeah. So I think it has a lot of science in it, but it's not like over the top. I think it's sort of just enough to sort of give it some authenticity, because I use like things like chromatography and things like that, which if I had started writing a lot earlier, I probably wouldn't have known anything about that. So I think it just it sort of adds to the credence, because these characters are scientists, so you expect them to think and act like a scientist.
Use those words.
Right. And I think that's why in this particular book I use that because you have scientists explaining to other scientists what do they think about God. So you would use scientific things to do that.
Wow,
yeah.
That's good. So how do you explain your statement that science and faith could go hand in hand?
Well, I think that's, well, as I was saying, I think well, a couple things. Is that one, I think people confuse science and truth. Some people think, well, science is truth, but I think science really points us to the truth. Because with science, you only can do what you have the experience with. Because, in the 1700s, you could never talk about a cell phone, whereas today it's so common. So you couldn't have probably prove or disprove that there would be a cell phone. But now I think so. But what you knew then sort of pointed people in that direction to where we are. But now, so the real truth, I think, comes from Scripture. And so I think once you get to the real truth from what science is going to show us, that it will be congruent with the Bible and not discongruent.
I can definitely follow that. That's probably one of the better ways. I've heard it explained, actually. So you got serious topics in your new books. Why did you choose to take on these big topics in fiction?
Well, as I say, I was, I had a doctorate in pharmaceutics, and then I had a doctorate in biblical prophecy, and those sound very, when you talk to certain people, that sounds, well, that's very congruent, opposite. So, how do you put that together? And I think that's what I wanted to do, is show that they really are not opposite. They really do go hand in hand, and. So I could have gone the nonfiction route, but I felt like fiction route maybe more people could relate to it, because even if you don't quite understand the science part of it or what it's doing, there's still a story there that if you can get people pulled into the story, maybe they'll follow through and hopefully take the same journey the characters are, because the characters are having, because it's a very godless society in which they're in, so they have to decide, first of all, they find out, okay, somebody's telling them there is a God. It's like, well, that's not what I was taught. So then they have to decide, well, what makes you think there is a God? Then they have to think, well, okay, maybe I can say, okay, there is a God, then does he really exist? If I'm going to accept that, then what do I do with that message? Do I just keep it to myself? Do I tell others? And I think many Christians, feel that, well, if I know about God and understand him, I can't just keep it to myself. I have to tell people. But here it's very, where in America we don't really have that problem, but in other countries that they do, where telling someone is really, it makes you a criminal. And so this is what this character went through, because he was now considered basically a terrorist, because now he believes there is a God and he's going to tell somebody, then that puts him in harm's way. The only difference here is that, not to spoil the story, but the harm that they go through is that they get deported to Mars. So not quite what we have to worry about right now, but that's something that they have to worry about.
Wow, that's good. So do you have more stories coming?
I do. So I had been probably writing for a decade or so, and so of course, as a struggling author, you get rejections, and so I just kept writing. But this was the first one, and I think it sort of shows how does man create a utopia, and you see that in order to do that, there's a lot of flaws, because, as I say, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the higher up in the echelon you get, the more control they have, and then, of course, their human nature comes out and they become very selfish. And then I do have another series coming out next year that's more about, how would God create a utopia, and how would you live in that type of utopia? And I think that sort of ties in with the technology part, that I think our future will be filled with technology. Depending upon what people's doctrinal beliefs are, is that when Christ returns, he'll set up a kingdom, and the Bible talks about it being a very agrarian type of society. But I think you can have agrarian and technology coexist together as well. So it's just and I think to give Christians an understanding of what could their future look like. I think even as Christians, we sometimes like, well, yes, I'm going to go to heaven, but do I know what that means, or what would I be doing? I don't want to play a harp all day and sit on the cloud. There are other things, and I want to give people at least some ideas, not to say that what I'm saying is how it will be, but Paul does tell us in 1 Corinthians that it's going to be more wonderful than we can even imagine. So I just want people to sort of at least get some imagination and think, okay, if it's going to be this, if I can say it's going to be this good, it's going to be even greater than that. And I would give people sort of an idea that there's another series after that one as well.
Wow.
And then the thought was that, is there life on other planets? It's like, I'm not sure that there is, but I know if there is, it's the same God. This other alien person may be worshiping some deity, but it's the same deity that I'm going to worship. So it sort of explores that area, and what would that look like? So that takes us more in a true science fiction area where you actually do meet aliens, and they look different than us. But it shows how God is a God of diversity, but also a God of unity at the same time.
Your mind must be constantly going with all these stories.
Well, sometimes it goes in some wild directions, I have to say.
Yeah, but I think that's just fascinating to have all those stories in your head. That's, for a non-writer.
Yeah, but they also sort of have a theme. I've always been intrigued with the Jewish feast and their prophetic significance that they have, and so basically all of the books sort of. That is sort of the common theme. It's sort of a different take in different directions, but it's showing that, I think the Bible is very real, very dynamic, and there's so much more to explore there than we think there is, for sure.
So have there been any surprises now being an accomplished writer? Like, were you surprised about any of the process? Or?
Well, it's what you mean as far as the writing and well, it's been a very interesting journey. I met a lot of neat people, people I would not have met in the academic aspects. So, and I've met a lot of people that have probably even a bigger imagination than I do. So, and it's nice to to talk with people. You get ideas. And actually, for this science fiction series, it just happened that I was actually talking with some friends, and the friend of mine, he's a character, so we just started talking all this wild stuff. But afterwards, I was like, well, what about that though? Can that happen? What would that do? And that sort of happened to turn into it. Because if I never talked with him, I would not have gotten that idea for this next series. So where you are, who you talk with, gives you more ideas that hopefully God can use to put it into something that He can use as well.
So I always like to end with a fun question. So what would readers be surprised to know about you?
What would be surprised to know about me? That's I don't know. It's well, I think. Well, first of all, I don't think people that knew me would ever thought that I would write anything, except because I was talking to a friend of mine, and I was mentioning that I was writing a book, and they're like, "Oh, I could never read your book; it'd be way over my head." I'm like, "Well, no, this is a fiction book." And she's like, "Oh, fiction? I would never pictured you as being a fiction writer because everything is is so scientific." So I guess it's that people understand that I really do have a fun side as well. So
an imagination.
An imagination, yes.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And so the books are THB, FSHS, and TULE.
That's right.
So what do they stand for?
Well, that's why you have to read the books.
Oh.
So, but I have to say the overarching thing is that these are codes that the main character discovers along his journey, and it's sort of like our journey, as we saying, so they all reveal something to him about God and God's character, and so coming from a godless society, as I say, it was all very revolutionary for him. In order to even think there was a God was a whole big step for him. So to go from that to becoming, to accepting who God is, and then telling other people about that was, is a huge monumental journey for him. So I'm hoping that people can sort of identify with that, and some of the questions and ideas that he has as a character in the book, I think is a lot of the ideas and questions that people have today. So hopefully they can have the same journey. Just probably not wind up on Mars.
Yeah. You never know. I think Elon Musk is working on it. Thank you, guys. We'll put the links in the blog.